Are you ready to listen? Welcome once again. Those of you who have been here a number of times are used to my usual spiel. First of all, is to remind you that this museum is part of the White River Valley Historical Society, and we depend on memberships in the society and donations, which most of you have been very helpful. Those of you who wish to be more helpful, thank you. Also, I also like to always point out that our friend Joe Reese and Barb, his wife, have been most generous in allowing us to use these facilities for the museum. Our next month's programs at the moment are TBA, to be announced, but you know that they're always good and interesting, so come anyway, even if you don't know yet what to plan on. So put it in your calendar. Well, today we have three distinguished gentlemen. And somewhat charming. And all are quite handsome.
Keep going.
So we're going to let the number one man, Larry Sifford, discuss who he is and what he's doing, and then he'll pass it to the other two gentlemen. Mr. Sifford?
Thank you, sir. Didn't recognize myself. He said distinguished. We were kind of looking around there. Good to see all of you here today, and thanks for coming out to listen to our presentation about what is going to be a book that we had recently written and published. And I'd like to just start it off a little bit today by sharing with you that I was born in West Plains, Missouri, and lived as a young boy over in Ozark County. That's where I grew up as a boy, and also in southern Missouri, down around the Mingo Swamp area. I had relatives down in the flatland and here in the Ozark Mountains. And I loved it here in these Ozark Mountains, and when my father moved us away from here to try to make a living back in about 1960, he moved us up to a little German community outside of St. Louis, South St. Louis, called Columbia, Illinois. And we found a job up there, and I found a bride up there. And so for 56 years I've been married to this young lady. Stand up, Judy. I want you to stand up and introduce my wife, because this is the one. We moved back to the Ozarks here in 1983. After several years, I wanted to raise my two sons, Justin and Ryan, where I grew up as a boy, because I thought you could never find a better place to raise children than on these lakes and streams and mountains in this part of the country. And I definitely wanted them out away from St. Louis. So in '83, I moved my family back over onto Dee Highway, which is over near between Kimberling City and Branson West. And we began building a home and building a small resort down there in a retreat center that we operated as a family. And that first year I was there, I was driving up Dee Highway, and at that time, that's 41 years ago, there was nothing hardly at all. You could get on that highway and never see another car until you got to 13 Highway. Whereas today, you got to be careful. We almost need a traffic signal in every corner. It's exploded. But at that time, as we went back, there was one old house and a house trailer that sat on the east side of the road. And that place and that location was owned by a family by the name of the Littles. And the Littles were homesteaders there for many, many years, and they were living at that present time, they had built a kind of an old ramshackle type clapboard house, and then they had a single wide trailer next to it, just up the road. And one day, I was driving by and I looked out and I saw a man out there skinning a raccoon, okay? Now back in those days, that was not uncommon. They ran traps still, and people trapped, and they still even, they possibly did coon hunting in these hills and ran dogs. But at this time, this man was running a trap line, and so I saw him stretching a hide on a board. Now this is one of the boards that Joseph Little made. This is still one of his old hide stretching boards, okay? Well, at that time, years before I had moved back down there, I also had hounds, coon hounds, and I ran dogs. I loved it. I was raised that way as a kid. And so I ran dogs, but then my dogs died, and I decided I wasn't going to hunt it much anymore because I'm moving down here and didn't really have any place to hunt. So I had what is called these stretchers left. And this is what you call our metal hide stretcher. And basically, they're kind of really unique because you can stretch them to any size and spread them out, and it's real easy to stretch a hide around on this. Well, I had these at my home. And so what I did is I ran on home, and then I grabbed the ones I had and brought them back and pulled up in front of Mr. Little's home. And I got out and I walked over and I introduced myself to him. I said, I'm Larry Sifford, I'm a neighbor here down the highway. And he looked at me like most hill folk do when they first meet you. Like, are you, okay, where are you from? What are you about? So I explained to him that I grew up in Ozark County, the boy over near Gainesville in Tecumseh. And when I said that, he kind of loosened up a little bit. And he kind of began to, and I said, I want to give you something. I don't coon hunt anymore, but I've got these hide stretchers that I would like to give to you as a gift. And I said, I don't use them anymore. So he said, well, how do they work? I don't even know how they work. And I said, well, do you have another coon to stretch? And he said, yes, I do. So we skinned it out. I stretched it on that stretcher for him. And from that day on, Joe Little thought the sun rose and set in me. I would go by there and stop and talk to Joe. Come to find out, he was a fiddle player, and I was a musician myself of some sort, of somewhat. And so we used to come up and play music occasionally, every now and then underneath an old maple tree that sits there on his property. And we became great friends. And I noticed, though, when I first met Joe, that there was something just a little bit different about Joe. He was kind of quiet and standoffish. He was friendly, but yet there was things that he did that just didn't quite look normal. Okay? And I didn't know much about that. So his brother then, I got to meet his brother Jack that lived up the road, and they said, Larry, anytime you want to hunt on our property here, you and your two boys, you're welcome to hunt, but nobody else hunts here. Don't invite nobody else in, just you. And I said, fine, I appreciate that. So my sons and I did hunt, and when we would kill a deer and butcher it, we would always bring them a backstrap or a ham off of that deer to feed their families, okay, or to feed them. Now, as time went on, Jack, his older brother, who was 7 or 8 years older than Joe, began to share with me some information about Joe. Joe was single. He was living by himself in his old house down there. His mother and father had passed away. Their names were John and Oma Little, and they had passed away. If you go down D.D. Highway, over in that area, there's still a log cabin standing by the electric grid there on D.D. Highway. That was the original home place. That's where Jack, John, Oma, and Joe lived, in that old log cabin. Their barn was across the road, and then there was a cave down below the hillside that they kept their dairy products in and a lot of their canning goods. They would take them down into the cave and had to have an old wooden ladder to get down in it. So, with that said, I began to find out as we visited more, and sometimes I'd be alone with Jack, talking to Jack, and Jack said, Larry, there's some things you need to know about Joe. And I said, okay. And he said, he was wounded severely in the Korean War, and his life was changed forever. I then, naturally, I'm a veteran. I was during the Vietnam era. I was in the United States Navy, discharged honorably, and I have a respect for fellow veterans, especially those who have been wounded severely. And he said he was wounded very severely, and it took a long time for him to get better. As time went on, I have found out more and more and more about that family. And as I did find out about it, I thought, my goodness, how a person's life can be changed so drastically from a child growing up in the Ozarks there, running down to the White River to fish and to swim. At that time, Table Rock Lake wasn't in yet. And the life that he lived as a boy, and then his fiddle playing. If you'll notice out on the wall out here, when you leave here today, go out on the far wall, and there's a picture of Allendale Resort. Allendale Resort was one of the first official paid gigs music jobs that Joe Little ever had. Inside this book that we have produced and published is a photograph of an Allendale poster stating that they're having dances tonight, square dances, featuring Joe Little and the Ozark Mountain Boys. And it said, how much? 50 cents for men and girls free. I don't know if they were giving them away or if that was what they were doing anyway. Long story short, there's some really interesting photographs in the book about the Little family. This book is about growing up in the Ozarks as a boy in a family that hewed ties, railroad ties for a living, picked tomatoes, grew tomatoes, took them to the canning factories in Reed Spring. It's about Joe Little's first love and had he met in high school. There's romance in this book. There is his drafting into Korea, tragedy, sorrow, recovery, bringing back and making lemonade out of lemons is basically what this book is about. It's a true story. I was very fortunate. For 26 years I wanted to write this story. 26 years it took me. I'm not real bright, folks. And it took a while to get me to be able to put this thing into a place or to trust someone to write it the way that I wanted to see it written. To display not only the personalities of these people in their personality and their life, but also the sorrow and the hurt. I looked around and I belonged to this organization called the Ozarkian Society of Ozarkian Hillcrofters. And on the board of directors there, I was at that time on the board. I still am on the advisory board, although they take very little advice from me anymore. But a gentleman on there that sat on that board as well was Hayden Head, who was a former professor of English and literature at College of the Ozarks. I got to know Hayden pretty well, and a man that I think a lot of and trust. And he is a wordsmith. He is absolutely one of the finest writers that I've ever written, ever ran into. And so when I sat down and said, Hayden, I have a story I'd like to tell you. Would you consider listening to me? And if that's the case, if you like it, would you consider writing this? So we sit down, and I shared the story in my living room with Hayden. And this has been almost a year ago, hasn't it?
It's been a while.
And I said, Hayden, what do you think? And he said, I love the story, and yes, I'd love to write it. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this over to my wordsmith, my co-writer. He is the man that when you read the book has put the personalities into it from the story that I shared with him. I shared with him the personalities of these people, and he has captured it perfectly in this book. So without further ado, I want to welcome Hayden Head.
Well, I'm not sure exactly what the expectations are, so I thought what I might do is just read a couple of passages, because what was exciting to me when Larry came with the story, I mean, it definitely has a great narrative arc for all the reasons that you're talking about, right? Which is what a story requires. But it's the idea of how to preserve an Ozark life, a time that's almost gone, and to try to do it in a way. I mean, one of the things that we had such a good time working on is it's a history, but it's also a story. So we tried to keep the narrative, the dialogue, what imagine things might have been like. So I'll just read a couple of passages and see whether or not you think it's effective or not, because ultimately it's the reader who's the ultimate judge. So, like Larry said, one of the points is that Joe was wounded. He was in a VA hospital for 7 years. He also talked about how he and his brother Jack would sled down Little Mountain on the hood of a car, that was their toy, so to speak. And so I just tried to figure out what might that look like. How do you imagine someone in a coma? And it's going to remain there for a while. So it's 1953, the VA hospital, Little Rock, Arkansas. In the darkness floats a ring of dull bronze, kind of like closing your eyes real tight and looking at the sun, or maybe like a cloud passing over an eclipse. They never seen a real eclipse. Saw a picture of one in the World Book. Off to the side, somewhere beyond the bronze circle, the thunder of an explosion and a brilliant spasm of light, shards of metal and a huge spattering of snow and dirt, almost a wave, and oil drums hurled into the trees, drums flipping end over end or rolling through the snow and leaving tracks. Also an arm with an epaulette. Sliding now, sledding, cold air rushing, sledding so fast and the air so cold it feels like fire. Hold on, Jack, we're going too fast. We're going to slide into the creek. Jack, what the? Look at them red birds down there in the snow, fluttering and limping around with broken wings. Some of them's dead. No, Joe, they're all dead. They ain't birds. It's blood, bright red. I can't understand what I'm seeing. Tell Lorraine the bronze circle returns, a weak ring in deep space, but the darkness overcomes the light. A machine in the corner hums and beeps with an all but meaningless rhythm while a nurse yawns and writes, breathing regular, heartbeat regular, response negative. The same notation will be recorded over 2,000 times in a 3-ring Bible. So just the effort to try to recall the event, and these are episodes that we worked out over time. And talk about it. How are we doing on time? Are we doing okay? Do y'all have the patience for just a little bit more? Okay. Just want to make sure, because I don't want to worry. I know it can be tedious to be read to. So as Larry mentioned, you know, one of the ways that the Littles made their money, right, in addition to tie hacking and the rest of it, was tomatoes. And they would get in the wagon and they would go to Reed Spring, and there was a cannery there. That's where Jack fell in love with Betty, his love. But one idea that just seemed kind of right was perhaps that John might take his fiddle with him, because a wagon ride can take a long time. And so this was something that Joe had never experienced. He had heard his dad play before, but not in such an unusual circumstance. So I'll just kind of start in the middle of this. John took the fiddle and tucked it under his chin. He held the bow in his other hand and drew the bow over the strings. "Sounds good enough," John said. And then he started fiddling. The song was Arkansas Traveler, but it wasn't the melody as much as the moment that transformed Joe Little. Joe had heard his father play before, of course, but not like this, not in the empty woods with a wagon load of tomatoes and his brother driving the mules. With the scrawling high whine and skipping jubilation of the bow, the sun-soaked morning became overwhelmingly bright. Joe felt a thrill and liberation he never forgot, a feeling only a child can fully inhabit. The reddish road carved from the forest and bordered by flowers still stretched before them, but their destination was more dreamlike, more like a castle in Jack the Giant Killer than a cannery in Reed Spring. The sawing of the fiddle imbued the clatter of the wheels and the rhythm of the hoofs and the passing of the September trees with a wild potency. The sky remained in immaculate blue, and the sparrows still chattered in the blackberry vines, but the unbounded arch and the irreverent chirpings merged with the music to become something altogether new. Furthermore, Joe was astonished that a man as grim and hard-working as his father could transform the whole of creation with an instrument of maple wood and horsehair. And as Joe watched John play, he realized that his father had not only transformed the world, he had transformed himself into something different, a man more alive than he had been. Let's see if I can get the right page. More alive than he had been, became more like John Little and less like a man hauling produce. Then John started singing. Oh, once upon a time in Arkansas, an old man sat in his little cabin door and fiddled at a tune that he liked to hear, a jolly old tune that he played by ear. And now there was not only music, but good humor, jollity even, a surge of silliness unprovoked by corn liquor, and depended on nothing but the notion that an old man wouldn't patch his roof when the sun was shining, because doing so would make no sense. So the cumbersome wagon with its ripe-smelling tomatoes and indifferent mules rattled down the road as John played and sang, and Joe was lifted up like St. Paul into something like an ecstasy. That evening, after their return to Little Mountain, Joe did indeed pester his father, but not for ginger snaps and sweetmeats. No, he begged his father to teach him how to fiddle. so that he might enter the strange dream at will, and thereby transform the hills and creek beds into something approaching Eden, or maybe even the third heaven. John was worn out from the trip, but he said, all right. And into the night, Joe was dragging the bow back and forth, exasperating Oma and setting the dogs on edge. Finally, Oma said, take that thing outside if you're going to keep at it. But even so, she couldn't sleep from all the scratchy sprawling of her son's first efforts. What Oma didn't know was that Joe and his fiddle were summoning the moon over Salcoon Mountain. So, anyhow, thank you. Working with Larry was such a pleasure on this story, and then for us to just kind of birth this thing was just a real treat. So thank you, Larry, for inviting me into the project and the opportunity to work together. Curtis? Or Larry?
I'll close it out.
Okay.
Let me have that book. Thank you, Hayden.
You bet.
This book means a lot to me because it not only talks about a man that I knew very well and the Ozark flavor, but it also tells the story of a true American patriot. A man who gave up most of his life and had it changed forever because of his defending of our freedoms. And so when you read this, you're going to see that come out in this. And that's what, as you go on through, but his poetic writing, the things that he saw are stories that I shared with him, that he put in, that it was shared with me by Jack and Joe Little. Now this cover on this book is really important to me because I didn't know what I wanted to put on the cover. I really didn't know what I wanted to use. And so one day I was sitting with my grandson, Harrison Sifford, and I said, Harrison, you're an artist, a very unusual artist. He has a very unique style of his artwork. He's a professional artist because he sells his work. He has sold work to Finland. He has sold work all over the United States. And so he's a very talented young man. And I said, let me tell you the story of how the Cardinals in the snow came about. And so I sat him down and I shared that story with him. And on this cover, if you do purchase this book, you're going to understand what this cover is all about. When you see two boys sled riding, you'll see Cardinals. And my grandson put this together and he depicted it absolutely perfectly. I could not have asked for a better. Harrison, would you please stand just for a moment? Stand up. Give my grandson a round of applause. I'm proud of him. He looks a little bit like Jesus. That makes me even more proud of him. And he even, you know what's even better? He even acts like Jesus. He does. He's a nice guy. So I love him. But thank you, son, for producing this for your grandfather, okay? So at that time, I'm going to present Mr. Curtis Copeland, who is our president of no, he's not. He's your chairman of the board now, president. He's not passed on. Chairman of the board for the Ozark and Hillcrofters, and also a regular attender of the Sycamore Log Church. So without further ado, won't you make Curtis welcome?
Well, I'm going to follow in Larry's footsteps a little bit, and I think it's important that we recognize the women in our lives that really keep us in line. I know Miss Judy is she's grown to be another mom to me, and she's just great and keeps me in stitches. But I'm really surprised to see my wife today showed up all the way from Ozark. So thanks, Crystal. Yeah, so Justin Sifford sitting up front here. This is my introduction to the Sycamore Log Church. Was years ago, just roaming the hills and driving the back roads. But the real introduction to the Sycamore Log Church about 5 years ago. And speaking of the Society of Ozark and Hillcrofters, what that is in a nutshell, it's an organization dedicated to the preservation of Ozark's history, culture, and conservation as well. So back about 5 years ago, I was trying to revive this organization that the death knell was actually World War II. So back in the late 20s through the 30s, and this organization existed. But World War II came along and people's interest kind of drifted away from the Ozarks and to larger, more worldwide concerns. But about 5 years ago, I was trying to round up some folks that might be interested in being on a board to get this organization started. And I called up an old friend of mine, Justin Sifford, and I said, hey, would you meet me for lunch? I'd like to talk to you about an idea I have. And he graciously found time in his busy schedule, and I think we met up at the Grand Country Cafeteria, or buffet. And we talked about Hillcrofters for a little bit, and then I don't know how, he goes, Curtis, what are you doing for church these days? I was like, is it that obvious I'm that honorary? But
It was.
I said, but I said, I've been, actually last several years, I've been looking around for a church home, been not necessarily disappointed, but just haven't found something that seems like home to me, something simple, something that is really like what would Jesus do? I know that's kind of cliche these days, but basically taking care of the community and those around us here in the Ozarks with not a lot of flair and not a lot of glamour and glitz, just down to the basics and learn about the Word. And Justin goes, well, you need to go check out and see what my dad's doing. And I'd never met Larry before. But I thought, okay, yeah. He said, head down to Sycamore Log Church next Sunday and see what's going on. And I went in through those doors and listened to what Larry had to say, and I'll let him talk a little bit more about that in a little bit, but I was like, I finally found home, And so that's kind of my introduction to Sycamore Log Church, but not to bore you all with that, I will talk to you a little bit about the history of Sycamore Log Church, because it is a very interesting landmark in our community, and the Branson, Shepherd of the Hills Country community. And so, how many of y'all were here last month to see John Fullerton talk about Garber? That was a fantastic presentation. John is the expert on Garber, Shepherd of the Hills Country, and I'm looking forward to his book coming out. So I won't rehash that too much, but just to explain where Garber is, it's up north of Branson, down along Roark Creek. Now Roark Creek runs from Reed Spring all the way down and winds down through and dumps into Lake Tinacomo right down here. But about halfway up between Branson and Branson and Reed Spring at that time was a little whistle stop on the railroad called Garber. And it was important to our history because the residents of Garber were tied to the Shepherd of the Hills story. And the Shepherd of the Hills is still an active outdoor drama. The book is still read by thousands every year. But it had a tremendous impact on the community, and people fell in love with it that were here locally, and people from the outside came to our area just because of that book. But one of the inhabitants was John K. Ross and his wife. John K. and Anna Ross, they were known as Old Matt and Aunt Molly in the book. And so Garber was a community that started around early 1900s, about 1902, incorporated in 1907, I believe. But there was several people in that little community, a lot more than there are now. Actually, most of it is now the new Shepherd of the Hills State Park. But at that time, back in the summer of 1932, this was during the Depression, and the folks in that community, they had what was called a brush arbor. And I apologize to those of you in the back, but this is an image of a brush arbor from back in the 1920s that Vance Randolph had taken. To give you an idea, it's basically just a bunch of brush, cedar limbs, oak limbs and that, put over as a canopy over some homemade pews, and they could have a worship service outside. And so the summer was coming to an end, and this had been a pretty successful brush arbor during the summer, but they were concerned, okay, winter's coming, it's going to get cold, we still want to meet, we still want to worship. So they reached out to a fellow by the name of Dr. John Crockett. Now, Dr. John Crockett, he was one of the early, maybe, I'm not sure if he's the first, but he's an early president of what was then School of the Ozarks. Now, School of the Ozarks used to be in a big stone structure up above Old Forsyth, up on the hill. He was there back in 1915, and around that same time period, the school burned, and then they moved the school over here to Point Lookout by Hollister, and they've been going strong ever since. But Dr. John Crockett was also had a pastor at a number of well-known churches in both Springfield and Oklahoma, and they called upon Dr. Crockett and said, "Hey, we're trying to get a church going down here. We need to build a building. What are we going to do? We don't have any money." And he said, "Build a church that will not cost you anything." And I really feel like that is a theme that continues to this day. You know, where we talk about carrying on Ozarks traditions and so forth. I think that what Dr. Crockett had said about that church was really important even to today. But to tell you a little bit about how this was done, again, it was built with about 25 people out of that little Garber community and the surrounding Rourke Valley community. 25 people came together. And for a grand total, stories vary, but somewhere between $18 and $25 they were able to build their church. And how they did it was, along Roark Creek down there, they had plenty of sycamore. Now, sycamore is not really a great wood for much of anything. It's kind of soft and not durable, and it's not like oak. Oak will turn into iron and last forever. But something's keeping this church standing and strong.
Not something.
Yeah, that's right. But you know, with a team of mules and 25 people, they felled a bunch of sycamores down along Roark and drug them up to the location. If you're familiar with Sycamore Log Church Road, it's not far from the railroad trestle. So the railroad would have been in operation for about nearly 30 years, or about 25 years by that time. But they drug those trees up underneath the trestle and constructed the Sycamore Log Church. The other things they did, the original roof was real oak-shake shingles that they got from the surrounding oak trees and split those shakes. I don't know if they were using them in the right sign of the moon or not, so they wouldn't curl, but maybe so. Chinking, you know, they mined lime from the local limestone, plenty of limestone around here, but they burnt it in a pit right there on the grounds of the church, made their own lime chinking. But the floor, for a long time, the floor was just dirt and a little bit of gravel from Roark Creek. The other interesting thing that they had was they cut down a massive walnut tree that had 3 prongs in it, and that walnut stump became the pulpit. And that pulpit is still there today and still used today, that same walnut pulpit. And interestingly enough, this is neat too. So remember I said it was a dirt floor for a long time. Whenever the spring rains would come in, that floor would get saturated and that old pulpit would start sprouting leaves. So on February 12th, 1933, they invited Dr. Crockett down to dedicate the church. And at that time, they didn't call it the Sycamore Log Church. It was dedicated as the Little Church of the Wildwood. And so back then, Highway 65 is what we now know as Highway 248. And the road to Garber, which was what the log church was along, was just an old gravel road. And they regraded it because they expected a big turnout from Springfield and surrounding areas. And they had, it was an all-day ceremony. They had a picnic on the grounds, and must have been a fantastic deal. But one of the neatest things is still there today. There's a big cedar slab, and on that cedar slab was the 121st Psalm that says, "I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills from whence cometh my help." So I know there's a lot of us in here that seek our strength not only from the Lord, but these Ozark Hills that just gets into our hearts and gives us strength as we see Him every morning when the sun's rising over them and see those beautiful sunsets as well. But it's really neat. That old sign is still up on the wall, inspiring folks, as well as that old walnut pulpit. But pretty soon, the other interesting thing is, so members weren't just from the Garber community. there was folks from Branson and Hollister and other areas, and not only that, but there was at least 6 denominations of folks. So even this early log church became more or less non-denominational and welcoming to everybody. And that's another interesting trait that carries on to this day. So the little Sycamore Log Church, as it became to be known, got kind of famous, became a landmark, and it still is today. So are any of you familiar with Guy Howard, the walking preacher of the Ozarks? Yeah, I figured most of you were. Guy Howard, he was another outlander, like so many of us that fall in love with the Ozarks and come here and call it home. He was a farmer from Iowa, and this was back in the 30s, again during the Depression. He had a few kids, and he had recently become widowed. He lost his wife. So on foot, they came to the Ozarks. He was in love with the Shepherd of the Hills country. He was a preacher, and he was kind of a circuit preacher. He would go around to different churches, but he would always go on foot. And his book, he came up with a book. He did about 4,000 miles a year on foot, going to these different churches and so forth. But during the 1930s, not long after the church was constructed, Guy Howard, now I say he was an early hitchhiker as well. So he had caught a ride on one of our windy Ozarks back roads in the back of a pickup truck with some old hillbilly. The old hillbilly had a little bit of a lead foot, and so he was going around these corners, and poor Guy was thrown from this vehicle, and he was injured. So he had no money, no insurance, Depression era, just a preacher trying to make the rounds and basically feeding his family with whatever the congregations would give to him, whether it be it food or tithes or whatever. So at that time, fortunately, there was what they called a government transient camp. It was one of those government programs similar to like the CCC or WPA back during that time period that was set up here in Branson. And their purpose of that camp was to build the airport. Y'all know where the airport was?
Whitewater.
Yeah, where Whitewater is. So Whitewater, Red Roof Mall, that big flat area, that probably the flattest place in Branson of any size, well, that was the airport. And so a guy went there to get some medical help and recover, but at that time, Sycamore Log Church was close enough that he could go and do some preaching, and that's what he did. And he immortalized Sycamore Log Church in his book, Walking Preacher of the Ozarks. And I'd like to read you just for a moment, if y'all aren't tired of being read to, a passage from the book about Sycamore Log Church by Guy Howard. My introduction to the Sycamore Log Church was a red letter day in my Christian life. This little church, built at a cost of much love, labor, and $18 in money, proved to be a spiritual shrine for me. It was located in a little dell surrounded by cedars that bordered a meandering mountain stream. The clear blue water sang nature's doxology as it tumbled over its rocky bed a few feet from the doorstep. The building, as the name implies, was constructed of heavy sycamore logs. The belfry across the center of the roof above the door was made of small logs. As I entered the building, my eyes were immediately focused on a plank which bore the inscription, "I will lift up mine eyes up unto the hills, from whence cometh my help." It hung on the log wall above the pulpit. The floor was of smooth washed gravel from the mountain stream. The roof of hand-split oak staves was supported by ridge poles which extended the length of the building. The pulpit was a three-pronged fork of a large walnut tree cut to the proper length and set upside down. Benches were all of rough oak lumber. The chaste simplicity of this woodland temple, the song of the water harmonizing with the soft sighing of wind through the cedars, brought tears to my eyes. It was like the singing of an angelic choir, peace on earth, goodwill to men. It must have been some similar sacred spot that inspired the psalmist to declare, "Be still and know that I am God." So the little church continued to grow in fame because we've got Mary Elizabeth Mankey. You all have heard of Mary Elizabeth. All right. Well, Mary Elizabeth, she has an interesting lineage. Her father was Alonzo Prather, which was, I always felt like he was the counterbalance to Captain Nat Kinney Alonzo was an educated man. He had a number of businesses, newspapers. He helped to start the university down at Arkansas, Fayetteville. But he was the second lieutenant of the Taney County Ball Knobbers, second to Nat Kinney. But he was a brilliant businessman. And again, Ball Knobbers is a whole other story, and it wasn't all about vigilantism. But that was Mary's father. Her son was Doug Mankey, who lived to be about, I think it was 104, but he spent 70 years, it was close to 70 years he practiced as an attorney and a representative in Taney County, and he was a great local historian himself. But Mary Elizabeth, she was known nationwide during the early 20th century for her poetry. She got her start at 14 years old working in her father's newspaper. I think it's called the Taney County Farm and Home, and as a country correspondent. And she lived in several communities throughout her young life and as an adult within Taney County. And she would write columns as a country correspondent from the various villages and towns that she lived in. So she was known for her journalism as well as her poetry, but she wrote a beautiful poem about the Sycamore Log Church. Again, bringing the spotlight back on this little log structure in the hills. Let me read it to you a moment because she's a great poet. They have builded a church of sycamore logs down in the Ozark Hills, near by the rippling water, near music of whippoorwills. A sacred shrine there in the mountains where old fires of holiness glow, and from ridges and rocky hollows come people I used to know, gathering at early candlelight, just as we used to do, when we bashfully sat together, young lovers ardent and true, with sly jokes of the marrying parson, or kind old Uncle John Spear, who baptized and buried and married us for nigh onto 40 years. Oh, take me back to my Ozarks, to the little log church on the hill, to find my lost faith and courage, and old friends who love me still. So that brings us to today. The Sycamore Log Church hasn't changed much in nearly 90 years. I guess it is 90 years now, isn't it? 90 years old. Still very much looks the same. It has a few amenities that make it more comfortable. A little bit of climate control and so forth. A little bit better accessibility. But for the most part, it still has that same flavor, that same feel. And it's definitely a sanctuary in the hills. You know, still have music on the porch, potluck luncheons. Whenever the weather is nice, we all gather outside and enjoy the beautiful Sunday mornings. But with that, thanks for allowing me a moment to talk about Sycamore Log Church's history. And I'll turn it over to our lay leader, Mr. Larry Sifford.
Thank you, Bert. Sycamore Log Church, first time I saw it was in 1983 or 84. When we moved down here, we were poor as church mice, and we were trying to start a business, and we had every bit of our income invested in that business. So what we would do is we'd go for a ride on Sunday with the boys, and we'd roll the windows down and take a ride through the hills, and one day we rode by Sycamore Log Church. And naturally it intrigued us. It was beautiful. It was upsetting that this was painted a picture of peace and tranquility. So we got out. And at that time, the church was unlocked, and we got to walk and look inside and look through the windows, and my boys were, at that time, 3 and 5 years old, and they were running around, and this is awesome, look at this old, you know. And so we got back in the truck and we left. And for 35 years, we never saw that church again, thereabouts. Not that we weren't looking for it, just that life went on, and we were involved in another church over in our area that was closer to home. And so about 7.5 years ago, starting our 8th year now, 8 years ago, my wife said to me, around December the 20th, she said, Larry, I would like for our little gathering, and at that time we had started what we call the Acts of the Shepherd Gathering. And it was basically an organization of Christians and believers who decided to meet together, pool our resources. We had no administration, no fee, no overhead, zero overhead. And we would give to the poor and needy of Stone and Taney County. And we started with 12 people. That was kind of an interesting thing because we thought it would work. Jesus did pretty good with 12. And so we started and we began to meet in the storefront of the auction house at the Merritt Auction House in Branson West. So that Christmas, my wife said to me, she said, Larry, I would like to have a Christmas Eve service. Because when she was a little girl growing up, they always had church on Christmas Eve, and she loved to go to Christmas Eve candlelight services. And so she said to me, I want to have one. I said, honey, Merritt's Auction House is not really conducive atmosphere for a candlelight service. And she said to me, I don't want to have it there. I said, you don't? I said, where do you want to have it? She said, I want to have it at Sycamore Log Church. I said, Judy, I don't even know anybody that's even involved with that. I don't, oh, she said, you will. Now, if you've been married for over 50 years, folks, you understand that you will means go find out. That's exactly what it meant, okay? So I did. And I approached one of the trustees about that, Mr. Bob Jones, who was the husband of Elda Jones, who the Johnson family that Elda came from are good close friends of ours. So in a roundabout way, we got hooked up and we said, could we use the church that evening? They said, oh yes, of course, please come. And in fact, they had a little lady there that was still having Sunday morning Bible studies, and her attendance had dwindled down to about 3 to 5 people. And she said, her name was Ruby Hopper, and I said, Ruby, well, you can bring your people, come with us that evening. You're welcome to come over to, she said, we'll do that. And that night, we absolutely packed that little church out. Everybody that heard about a candlelight service at Sycamore Log Church wanted to come. We had the old wood stove in the center of the building, warmed up. We got there 2 or 3 hours early and warmed the old building up. And we sat around the old wood stove. And that night we sang Christmas carols. We had our candlelight service, and we told the story of Jesus' birth. Well, the next week, I was contacted by one of the trustees, and they said, Larry, would your gathering group, at that time we were about 15 or 20 people, and they said, would your gathering group like to come and use this facility? We want to keep it active for the Lord. We want to keep it to be used for Christian service. And I said, well, I'll ask them if they would like to. So I went back the next Sunday and asked them for a raise of hands of who would like to start using the Sycamore Log Church for worship in the future. And at that time, every hand went up and said, yes, we'd love to do it. Since that time, as of about last Sunday when we had dinner on the grounds, we had, I don't know if you came in the back, can't see it, but we had over 100 people there on dinner on the grounds Sunday. In fact, I said several. How many were there that day? Raise your hand if you were there that day. I see quite a few of you going up there. Okay. Well, since then, we average now, probably on a Sunday, of 60, 65, 75 people in as the numbers float around. But here's the wonderful thing about that. And if you're a believer, you can relate to this. If you're not a believer, I'll pray for you, okay? Here's what I found out about this. Is that when we started this, we continued exactly the way that Sycamore Log Church began, unbeknownst to us, with operating with zero overhead. We have no administrative cost. We have absolutely no rent fee. We do pay an electric bill, but that's usually done when somebody just gives a love offering or something to pay for that. But 100% of the tithes and offerings that come into that little church, that little gathering, goes back into supporting missions here in Stone County, Faith Community Health, Pregnancy Lifeline, our Sister's Keeper, several more. I can't remember them all right now, but those missions we support, and then we also help out with individual, Elevate Branson, which was Jesus was homeless, we help them. And so the 100% of our tithes and offerings will go back to helping people in Stone and Taney County. Here's what I saw in years past in my experience with churches. We were good at sending lots and lots of money overseas to lots of places, okay? And I saw children barefoot in Stone and Taney County. My wife worked for the school district. in Reed Spring, and we saw kids come to school hungry. And I'll say, far be it from us to ever not try to help our own first, because the book I read says first in Jerusalem and then to the other parts of the earth. And that's what we try to pattern after at the Sycamore Log Church. Know this, you're welcome to come anytime and visit. You may not find a place to sit, but come on anyway. Easter Sunday morning we had, I think, 75 inside and 45 outside. So come visit us if you wish. Come and see a piece of the history and understand that God is still in the business here of taking care of our folks here in the Ozarks. Again, thank you, all of you, for coming out today. Thank you for having us here today to share our information with you. We will be signing books outside here if you'd like to see. Talk to Hayden and I about Cardinals in the snow. We'd be happy to help you out. Thank you. God bless you all.
Once again, we've had an outstanding program, and we hope you all enjoyed as much as I did. Do you have any questions for any of these three gentlemen? Well, they were very thorough in their presentation. Thank you. We'll see you next month. Don't forget the books.
So, Dr. Shirley,
Doc Shoemaker. There were two docs that were there during that time frame. Doc Shoemaker and Hayden Head, because their cars was in the early 40s. And Greensburg, so he came out and he was there every day, every night. And then he goes to the place, taking on home, he went back during spring and slept on the way back. All right.
You did a good job, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
We were just talking, I said, I'm looking at.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I can just give them to you. I mean, it's just an outline, but yeah, I mean, this is my outline, but it has the information in it.
Can you take a picture of it?
You can have that. I just printed it out right before I came here. So. Yeah, Walking Preachers. It's a good book. Yeah. Some of her poetry books are out there. Yeah. And there's a biography by Ellen Gray Massey called Candle Within My Soul, and that's a biography of her, which is a good book too.
I start taking notes.
Okay.
Send myself emails.
Yeah, I think you'll enjoy that book too.
So what was it now?
A candle within her soul, I think is what it's called. Ellen Gray Massey, last name Massey. There it is.
Yeah, I got it on my
Okay.
I was talking by text.
Gotcha.
And it just, I had some talking, but it picked up your voice.
Oh, okay.
Perfect. Thank you, Curtis.
You're welcome. Hey, Cheryl.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. I'm going to push stop here.